I stood there with my hand in her grip, 43 people watching, my mother gone still across the room, and I did not pull back, because I already knew Marcus was moving, and some battles are won by the woman who simply refuses to flinch first. She picked up my hand without asking. That is where it started. Not with the words, though the words came quickly enough. It started with the gesture, the particular entitlement of a woman who has never believed that other people's bodies or belongings required her permission before she touched them. We were standing in the middle of my engagement party, 43 people around us, my mother's good tablecloths on the tables and the good glasses out and the kind of careful, loving preparation that takes 2 days and shows in every detail, and Patricia reached across and picked up my left hand the way you pick up an object you are assessing for quality. She turned my hand toward the light. She tilted it once. Then again. Then she said, in a voice pitched at exactly the volume required to be heard by the 8 people standing closest to us, "Is that the ring?" I thought Marcus had better taste than that. The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent in a wave, the way silence travels when something has been said that requires a moment for everyone present to confirm they heard what they thought they heard. I watched it move. I watched people's faces change. I watched my mother, across the room near the food table, go very still. I did not move my hand. I did not pull it back. I stood there with my hand in Patricia's and I looked at her face and I understood, in the specific way you understand things that you have suspected for a long time and are now simply being confirmed, exactly what the next several years of my life were going to require of me if I was going to protect what Marcus and I were building. Marcus was standing 6 feet away talking to his uncle. I felt rather than saw him go still. Patricia was still holding my hand, looking at the ring with the expression of someone who had expected more and was genuinely disappointed in what they had found. Then Marcus crossed the 6 feet. I need to go back before I go forward, because the ring comment did not come from nowhere and understanding where it came from is necessary for understanding everything that followed. Marcus and I had been together for 3 years before the engagement. We met at work, the specific and slightly mundane origin story of 2 people who were thrown together by proximity and discovered, over the course of several months of proximity, that they wanted to be thrown together permanently. He was careful and funny and direct in the way that people who have thought seriously about how they want to move through the world are direct, and I was, I think, the first person he had been with who did not require him to be anything other than exactly that. I knew about Patricia early. Marcus did not hide her or minimize her or present a softened version of who she was. He told me, in the matter-of-fact way he told me important things, that his mother had strong opinions about the kind of life her son should live, which in practice meant strong opinions about the kind of woman her son should be with, which in practice meant that any woman who was not in possession of a particular set of credentials, financial and social and presentational, was going to be assessed and found insufficient before she had said a single word. I was, by Patricia's scale, insufficient. I had a job I was good at and proud of and that paid me well enough, but that did not have the title or the industry or the visible status markers that Patricia considered necessary. My family was not the kind of family whose name meant anything in the rooms Patricia cared about. I drove a car that was 7 years old. These things were known to Patricia within approximately 40 minutes of our first meeting, and they arranged themselves into a conclusion she had reached before we sat down for the lunch she had organized at a restaurant selected specifically because it was the kind of restaurant that required a reservation 3 weeks in advance. She was not rude at that lunch. She was something more sophisticated than rude. She was warm in the way that communicates assessment rather than welcome. She asked questions that were designed to locate me on a map she had already drawn. She listened to my answers with the attention of someone scoring a test. At the end of the lunch she told Marcus, in front of me, that I seemed like a lovely girl. Lovely girl. Not lovely woman. Lovely girl, with all the diminishment that distinction carries. Marcus said, "She is a lovely woman and I am in love with her." Patricia smiled and asked for the dessert menu. The 3 years between that lunch and the engagement party were 3 years of Patricia and me existing in a state of managed civility that was, on her side, primarily management, and on my side, primarily civility. She attended family events and I attended them, and we were both present and correct, and nothing that could be pointed to as an incident occurred, but the temperature of every room she and I occupied together ran a few degrees below comfortable in a way that everyone present felt and no one named. She made comments. Not constant, not crude, but regular enough to have a pattern. About my apartment, when Marcus and I had not yet moved in together, and whether I did not find it a little small. About a dress I wore to a family birthday dinner and whether I had considered something a bit more structured. About my job title, which she always repeated back to me with a fractional hesitation before it, a pause so brief it could always be denied, but that was always there. Marcus noticed everything. He was not someone who missed things. But he was also, and this matters to the story, someone who believed in allowing people the space to make their own choices and reveal their own character, and who did not believe in having confrontations on behalf of one person with another person who had not yet done something that required one. He would say, on the drive home from events where something had been said, "I heard that. I'm sorry." And I would say, "I know you heard it." And we would leave it there because we both understood that the time for the larger conversation was not yet and that forcing it early would only produce a performance rather than a reckoning. We were waiting, both of us, for the thing that would make the larger conversation unavoidable. The engagement party was the thing. Marcus's uncle was named Gerald. He was a man in his late 60s, Marcus's father's brother, who had the quality of someone who had seen a great deal and found most of it interesting rather than alarming. He was the person Marcus had been speaking to when Patricia picked up my hand. When Patricia said what she said, Gerald went very still in a specific way and then looked at his shoes, which told me he had some context I did not yet have. The 8 people closest to us had heard it clearly. 2 of them were my friends, women I had known for years, and I saw in their faces the specific expression of people who are deciding in real time whether to intervene or to wait. They waited, which was the right decision, because what came next needed to come from Marcus, and not from anyone else. Marcus covered the 6 feet in the way that people cover distance when they are moving with purpose but without urgency, which is more unsettling than moving fast. He stopped beside me. He put his hand on my back. He said, to the group of 8 and to Patricia and to the room at a volume just large enough to be heard, "Mom, can I show you something?" Patricia had the grace, or the instinct, to understand that the tone of the question meant it was not actually a question. She released my hand. She turned toward Marcus. And Marcus leaned in close to her ear. He was close enough that only she could hear what he said. I was standing next to him and I could not hear the words. I could see Patricia's face while he spoke. I watched her expression change. I want to describe what I saw in Patricia's face during those 45 seconds because it is the most important sequence in this story and I want to get it right. The first thing was incomprehension. Not the incomprehension of someone who has not heard, but the incomprehension of someone who has heard and is finding that the words do not fit any available category. Her eyes stayed on the middle distance in the way eyes do when a person's attention has gone inward to process something unexpected. Then there was recalibration. I can only call it that. Something shifting behind her face, a series of small adjustments happening fast, a person realigning their understanding of the room they were standing in. Then there was something I had not expected to see and that I am still thinking about. Something that was not quite embarrassment and not quite shame but was in the territory between them, the specific expression of a person who has just understood that they have miscalculated very badly and that the miscalculation has been witnessed. Marcus straightened up. He was not unkind in his expression. He was not triumphant. He looked, if anything, slightly tired, the way you look when something you have been patiently waiting to address has finally required addressing and you are relieved it is done but not pleased about the necessity. Patricia said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I see." 2 words. Then she excused herself and went to find the bathroom and was gone from the immediate area for about 7 minutes, which is approximately the amount of time a person needs to collect themselves after a significant recalibration. The 8 people who had been standing close enough to hear the original comment had been watching all of this. None of them said anything. My friend Rachel, who had known me since university, caught my eye across the small distance between us and raised her eyebrows. I gave her the microscopic headshake that meant, later. Marcus squeezed my hand. He said, quietly, just for me, "Are you all right?" I said, "What did you say to her?" He said, "I'll tell you later." He said it in a way that meant the later was a promise and not a deferral, and I knew him well enough to trust the difference. The party continued. This is the thing about events where something significant happens in the middle of them, they continue, because people have driven distances and brought gifts and poured wine and the social machinery does not stop for a moment's drama no matter how charged that moment was. People circulated. My mother refilled platters. My father made a toast that was warm and specific and that made Marcus laugh genuinely, which is the best a toast can do. Patricia returned from wherever she had been and moved through the room with a different quality than she had moved through it before. Not subdued exactly. More considered. She spoke to people with the attention of someone who has been reminded that other people in a room are also thinking and observing and drawing conclusions. She was, for the rest of the evening, almost careful. She came to me once before the end of the night, when Marcus was across the room and we were briefly adjacent near the drinks table. She looked at my hand. At the ring. She said, "It is a beautiful ring, actually. I did not look at it properly before." I said, "Thank you." She said it with an effort that was visible enough to be its own kind of acknowledgement. I received it as such. I did not offer more than thank you and I did not offer less. I was not going to perform a warmth I did not yet feel toward her, and I was not going to punish her for a first attempt at correction in front of the drinks table at my engagement party. She nodded and moved away, and Marcus appeared at my elbow, as if he had been watching for the moment she left it. I said, "Are you going to tell me now?" He said, "Let's go outside for a minute." We stood on my mother's back porch in the November cold, and Marcus told me what he had said to his mother. He had told her the price of the ring. Not as a boast. Not as a correction of her assumption in a showy way. Simply and directly and quietly, the way Marcus told people things he needed them to know, he had told her what the ring had cost. The ring was not cheap. The ring was the furthest thing from cheap. The ring was something Marcus had spent 14 months selecting and saving toward, and had purchased from a designer whose work he had been following for years, and who had made something specific to his description of me and what he wanted the ring to say about the beginning of our life together. It was not ostentatious. It was not the kind of ring that announces itself from across a room. It was the kind of ring that rewards looking closely, which is why it had not rewarded Patricia's 3-second glance from a standing position in a lit room. The number Marcus had told her was not a number Patricia had expected. The number was, I understood in retrospect, the thing that had produced the recalibration I had watched happen across her face. Not because the money was the point. The money was not the point. The point was that the number collapsed the story she had been telling herself about Marcus and me and the kind of future we were building, the story in which I was an insufficient choice made by a son who had not been careful enough about what he deserved. The number made that story incompatible with the evidence. I stood on the porch in the cold, and I felt several things at once. I felt the specific satisfaction of a miscalculation being corrected by facts rather than by argument. I also felt something more complicated. Something about what it meant that the correction had required a number. That the thing which had moved Patricia was not 14 months of watching me be good to her son, or 3 years of showing up to family events and being present and correct and decent. It was a number. That was what had moved her. I told Marcus this. I said, "I am glad she knows. I also think it is interesting what it took." He said, "I know. I am sorry it took that." I said, "Don't be sorry. It is useful information." He said, "That is what I love about you. You keep calling things useful information." I said, "What else would you call it?" He said, "A lot of people would call it a reason to write her off." I said, "Maybe. But she is your mother." And she looked at the ring at the drinks table. He said, "She did." I said, "That counts for something." He pulled me in from the cold, and we went back inside to our party and our guests, and the beginning of our life as engaged people, and Patricia was in the living room talking to my aunt, and she looked up when we came back in, and she met my eyes for a moment, and she did not look away first. That was something too. The engagement was 14 months long. This is relevant because 14 months is enough time for patterns to either calcify or shift, and what happened between Patricia and me over those 14 months was a slow and imperfect and real shift that I want to describe honestly rather than cleanly, because the honest version is more useful than the clean one. She did not transform. I want to be precise about this because stories like this one tend toward a transformation narrative, and that is not what happened. Patricia did not become a different person or arrive at a fundamental change in her values. She was still someone who organized the world by status and resources and visible markers of success. She was still someone who assessed people through those lenses before she engaged with them as people. What changed was that I passed through her assessment. The number Marcus had told her had located me on her map in a different place than she had placed me before, and from that different place she was willing to look at me more carefully, and looking more carefully had eventually produced something that resembled genuine regard. I know what that sounds like. I know it sounds like the regard of a woman whose values I find fundamentally flawed, and it was. It was also the only regard she was capable of offering, and it was being offered, and I had to decide what I did with it. I decided to accept it as the beginning of something rather than as a sufficient thing in itself. The first real conversation Patricia and I had, meaning the first one where something true was exchanged in both directions, happened about 6 weeks after the engagement party. Marcus was not present. We had ended up at the same nail salon appointment, which was an accident that I suspected my mother-in-law to be of arranging but could not prove, and we sat next to each other for 40 minutes with the specific enforced proximity of a service environment where leaving early would be obvious. She asked about my work. Not in the assessing way she had always asked before, the way that was looking for credentials and titles, but with the slightly uncertain quality of someone trying out a new approach and not entirely sure of the footing. I told her about a project I was working on that I was genuinely excited about, and she asked a follow-up question and I answered it, and she asked another one, and at some point I realized we were having a conversation rather than an interview. At the end of it, while we were waiting for our nails to dry, she said, "Marcus talks about you very differently than he has talked about anyone else." I said, "What does he say?" She said, "He does not say much specifically. He just sounds different when your name comes in. There is a quality to it. I noticed it a long time ago and I did not want to see what it meant. I looked at her. This was the most honest thing she had ever said to me and possibly one of the more honest things she had said about herself in my presence. I said, "What did it mean?" She said, that he had found the right person and that the right person was not what I had imagined the right person would look like. I said, "What had you imagined?" She said, "Something more like me, I suppose." Which was not fair to him. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "It was not fair to me either." She said, "No. It was not." That was the most she offered. It was not nothing. For Patricia, in that nail salon, it was a significant concession, and I received it as such without requiring it to be more than it was. The wedding was in June. It was outside, which Patricia had raised a concern about in the planning stages because of weather, and which turned out to be a perfect day, warm and clear, the kind of June day that feels like a gift specifically because it cannot be guaranteed. Marcus and I had planned it almost entirely ourselves, with help from my mother, and the result was a day that looked and felt like us rather than like a wedding in the abstract, which was what we had wanted. Patricia wore a dress that was exactly right for the occasion, which I noted because it was the first family event where she had not worn something fractionally too formal, fractionally too much, in a way that communicated distance from the proceedings rather than presence in them. She wore something that said, "I am here, and it is enough to be here, and I do not need my outfit to say anything else," and whether she was conscious of that communication or not I do not know, but I received it. During the reception she danced with Marcus to a song I did not know, and that was clearly something from his childhood, a private reference, and I watched them from across the dance floor and saw in her face something unguarded that I had not seen before. She was not performing anything for anyone. She was just dancing with her son at his wedding, and there was something in her face that was purely that, love without management, for the length of one song. I was glad to see it. It was information about who she was underneath the architecture she had built, and the person underneath was someone I thought I might eventually be able to know. We have been married for 3 years now. Patricia and I are not close in the way that some women describe being close to their mothers-in-law, the effortless warmth and telephone calls and the relationship that runs alongside the marriage as its own separate bond. We are not that. We are something more carefully constructed and perhaps more durable for the construction. She comes to dinner once a month. She asks about my work with interest that has become, over time, genuine rather than performed. She has opinions about things I disagree with and I say so, and she finds this, I think, more interesting than she expected to find it. She is direct in the way Marcus is direct, and I have come to understand that this quality, which I encountered first as hostility, is actually just her primary mode of moving through the world, and that when it is not directed at me from a position of assessment it is something I can work with. She has never mentioned the ring again directly. But she gave us, as a first anniversary gift, a piece of jewelry that she told Marcus she had selected because she thought I would appreciate things that rewarded looking closely. I opened the box and looked at what was inside and then looked at Marcus, who was watching me with the expression he gets when something has landed exactly where he hoped it would land. I put it on. I wore it to the next family dinner. Patricia saw it and smiled. Not the smile she used for management. The other one, the unguarded one I had seen once on the dance floor. I smiled back. I think about the engagement party sometimes. I think about the specific moment of standing there with my hand in Patricia's while she tilted it toward the light, and what I felt in those seconds before Marcus crossed the room. What I felt was not humiliation. I want to say that clearly because humiliation would have required me to agree with her assessment, and I did not agree with her assessment. The ring was not cheap. Our life was not insufficient. My work was not a lesser category of human contribution than whatever Patricia had decided earned dignity in her scale of things. What I felt was tired. The specific tiredness of having been assessed and found insufficient by someone who had not looked closely enough to see what they were assessing. The tiredness of 3 years of managed civility in service of a relationship with someone who had not yet decided to actually look at me. Marcus crossed the room and leaned in and said something in 45 seconds that recalibrated everything. I have thought about whether that bothers me. Whether the fact that it was a number, that it was a price, that it was something legible in Patricia's existing language that finally moved her rather than something I had done or said or been, whether that diminishes the shift that followed. I have decided it does not. Not because the number was what mattered, but because the number was the door, and what mattered was what happened once the door was open. People arrive at seeing through whatever door their particular architecture provides. The door Patricia had available was a number. What she did when she walked through it was her own. She walked through it. That was her choice. And 3 years of monthly dinners and real conversations and a piece of jewelry selected because she thought I appreciated things that rewarded looking closely, those are also her choices. People who have misjudged you can sometimes become people who see you. The path from one to the other is rarely the path you would have designed. But the arrival matters more than the route. Patricia arrived. Slowly, and perfectly, through a door I would not have chosen. But she arrived. And Marcus's hand on my back in the middle of my engagement party, the steadiness of it, the absolute certainty it communicated about where he stood, that was never in question for a single moment. That has been the constant. Everything else has been the work around it. The ring is on my hand right now. It catches the light the way it has always caught the light, in the specific way of something designed to reward attention rather than announce itself. Some mornings Marcus sees me looking at it and he has the expression of someone who made a good decision and knows it. I made a good decision too. Not just the ring. Not just the marriage. The decision, in the middle of my engagement party with 43 people around me and my hand being held up to the light for someone else's assessment, to stand still. To not pull back. To wait for Marcus to cross the room because I knew he was already moving. That was the right decision. Some things you hold steady through and some things you fight through, and the wisdom is in knowing which is which. I held steady. Marcus crossed the room. Everything that mattered took care of itself from there.